This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. And today's episode is something that I've been looking forward to for 2 years, actually, since I first got in touch with today's guest, Sarah Blaffer Hrdy. She is one of the giants of the field of human evolution. She was one of the first very big names that I had the courage to get in touch with, partially because she was the reason that I got interested in human evolution originally. She was very kind, very generous, said that she would be happy to do this, but would prefer to do it when her next book comes out. And, the time is now. Her next book is a third one in a trilogy about human parenting. The first one was called Mother Nature, about motherhood. The second one was called Mothers and Others, about the particularly high need for support that human mothers have from a deep line of evolution, separating us, by the way, from chimpanzees, whose mothers tend to do everything by themselves. Well, you might even guess the topic of her third book. It's on fathers. It's called Father Time. It's an excellent book, which, as I said, is out next week. You can already pre-order a copy. I've left links to it in the show notes. We do discuss this third book, Father Time, today, but it was a very special opportunity to sit down with Sarah Hrdy, and we really go through kind of her whole career and the way that she has time and time again worked against stubborn myths, the myths around what human females are supposed to be like, what human males are supposed to be like, what human childhoods are supposed to be like, and what a good parenting is supposed to be like. Now, these are themes that are, of course, of obvious interest to anyone who is becoming a parent, is a parent, wants to be a parent. But this is not just a biologically informed parenting guide. It's very typical for people to think about humans comparing us to our closest evolutionary cousins, chimpanzees. And what Hrdy's work has really done in many ways is to show of just how limited this comparison is, despite its many values. And who would have thought, it turns out that some very, very small monkeys in South America are in many ways actually more similar to humans than chimpanzees are, and how you can appreciate this similarity when understanding us through the eyes of the way we raise our children. So this is not just an episode about parenting, but it's also an episode about who we are, how we came to be, and what can studying monkeys and apes and others teach us about ourselves. There's always a special feeling when you're talking with a giant, and Hrdy truly is a giant. As you will see, she's a very humble and self-critical giant, but she's a giant nevertheless. And not to sound too corny, but on her shoulders, many of my previous guests have stood, and in some sense I do. I will always be grateful for her for inspiring me to get interested in human evolution. And I hope that you feel maybe something similar when listening to her today. If you do, I just want to quickly remind that I don't run any ads on these episodes. So instead, you will have to bear with me for 30 seconds when I quickly mention that I really, really welcome any little support, whether it's just following, sharing with a friend, giving a nice review, or if you want to show some serious monetary support, you can do so in a very low budget on patreon.com/onhumans. Thank you so much to every one of you who do support me on Patreon. It's really, really wonderful and keeps me motivated. I also want to quickly announce that I am writing a book. It's a book about the history of humans, and it's written for readers of all ages. And I'm starting to publish some chapter drafts for Patreon supporters. So if you want to have a little glimpse of what's coming, you know what to do. You can head to patreon.com and have a look. Anyway, without further ado, let's get back to the show. I bring to you Sarah Blaffer Hrdy. Professor Sarah Hrdy, welcome to On Humans.
Delighted to meet you, Elon.
You work with human childhoods, human parenting, and you now have your third book on the topic coming out, Father Time. And I promise to you and to the listeners that we will drill more into that towards the end. But most generally, what would you say are some of the common misconceptions that you feel like you are unsatisfied with and want to push against or want to give alternatives to in your work, if looking at it for a moment as a big whole?
Well, so many of the misconceptions that I have spent my life correcting, the paradigms I have changed, are misconceptions that I myself fell for early on. I grew up in the South, in a very kind of patriarchal, quite sexist, also racist part of the world, South Texas. Well, I thought that females were demure and non-competitive and were really going to just focus on their family.
That was what is natural for human females.
For female primates in general. Yeah. So it was a revelation to me to realize how competitive females could be in the spheres that actually matter to them. And so, of course, that was in my thesis, The Langurs of Abu, back in 1975, which, by the way, was the first time I believe that the term allomother was ever used. It was suggested to me by one of my thesis advisors, my revered mentor, Edward O. Wilson. Back then, we were calling them aunties and uncles. That's the primatologist term for a group member other than the mother caring for a baby. And he said, Sarah, you need a more dignified term than that. How about allo, Greek for other? How about allomothers? And then, of course, it's now in the Merriam-Webster online dictionary, and there's an Allomother's Day right before Mother's Day now, to celebrate
Really?
the allo.
Okay, well, congrats.
No mother can have too many allomothers, and
Yeah.
including the dad's helping too. Yeah, but people have trouble wrapping their brain around the possibility that a male can be an allomother. He's just other than the mother helping. Fun.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I'm sure that there are men who don't want to be called allo mothers because of the kind of, I'm not a mother by any means.
Well, we need to change our definition of masculinity. We need to expand Darwinian theory to include selection pressures on females, such as why they would compete with one another. But we also need to expand our definitions of masculinity to include this tremendous capacity for care that men have under certain circumstances that just easily emerge. Well, they have to spend a great deal of time in intimate proximity to babies.
And so if in the beginning you said one of the misconceptions you were kind of falling for yourself and then wanted to correct was the idea that females are not competitive. I guess the most recent one would be the idea that males cannot be caring in between.
In between. Well, first of all, when the book based on my PhD thesis came out, The Langurs of Abu, Female and Male Strategies of Reproduction, disappointed that so many of the reviews just focused on what the males were doing. And for example, infanticide, which is very dramatic. And so males from outside were eliminating the offspring of their competitors to stop a female from nursing and induce her to ovulate again sooner. It took me time to figure that out. And that was when I became a sociobiologist, because theories that were being taught at Harvard then about sexual selection, work like Bob Trivers' 1972 paper, Parental Investment and Sexual Selection, influenced me very, very much and helped introduce me to sexual selection theory, which, by the way, is one of the things I'm now interested in correcting. But that's okay. It was right when it applied to infanticide. But the reviews were just about what the males were doing. So my next book, The Woman That Never Evolved, I made a conscious decision. I'm just going to focus on what females are doing.
It's a great title.
Well, some people think I was just playing for a creationist audience, but the home back in Texas. No, it was to correct this paradigm of just looking at selection pressures on males. And people thought, oh, she must be some kind of raving feminist because I was just writing about females. In fact, I think, for me, feminism is someone who believes in equal opportunities for both sexes. And that would include, if you're looking at it from an evolutionary perspective, looking at selection pressures on females as well as males. And it only becomes political in situations where there's pushback. Certainly popular accounts of human behavior, there already were pushbacks because this focus on male dominance was so prevalent. So it really was just to call attention to selection pressures on females. And then, of course, my life as a mother really started to intervene with so much. So my first baby was born in 1977, Katrinka. At that time, once again, I was in the throes of very powerful theory, I think, and a great hero, John Bowlby, and his views on attachment. And attachment theory was one of these things that it was just a tremendously insightful view of infant needs.
Could you give
But
maybe just for listeners like a 1 minute summary?
sure. So John Bowlby was preceded in psychology by very influential psychologists like John Watson, who kind of argued that, oh, your baby is crying and you pick him up, you'll just spoil that little baby.
Yeah, you're teaching them to cry more.
You need to socialize these children to be independent and so forth. And Bowlby came along, and in a very classic paper early on, 44 juvenile delinquents, almost all of them had been separated from their mothers in hospital briefly during development. He said, that's not so good for babies. And On Attachment was published in 1966. My goodness, no evolutionary theorist has done more for human well-being than John Bowlby, because he recognized the emotional needs of human infants to feel secure. However,
that's a powerful statement. Yeah.
had a-
And I would agree.
yes, he had a wrong starting assumption, though. And starting assumptions is often where the trouble lies. His assumption was to understand what he called the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. That's his term. It's become quite famous. That was Bowlby's term. And he argued that in the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, our ancestors out on the savannas in Pleistocene Africa must have been like other terrestrial primates. And then he scratched his head and thought, who would I pick? And then he picked gorillas. True, they spend a lot of time on the ground. Chimps spend a lot of time on the ground. Baboons, a lot of time on the ground. And some of the macaques, I think rhesus macaques. These species do spend a lot of time on the ground, but they also are distinguished by having exclusive maternal care. So a baby chimp will not be out of its mother's possessive touch for a single moment of the day or night. For the next 6 months, she's going to be nursing it, 4 to 6 months, going to be nursing it and not leave it alone for a moment. She's extraordinarily possessive.
So these are superhero mothers, but there's no passing around the baby of, oh, look how cute.
And if I were a chimpanzee mother, I would be possessive, because one of those group members, male or female, could take and eat my infant or do something bad to it. I could on those around me.
And so Bowlby takes these land living great apes like chimpanzees as the model, and therefore in his model, which does, I think you say rightly, put the infant's need for attachment, for warmth, for bonding at the center, then puts only the mother as the provider of that care, that warmth, that bonding. And that's the mistake, right?
He did soften his views a little bit over time, influenced by Mary Ainsworth, but he would always come back to exactly what you said. Now, in 1966, we already had preliminary information. These are very early days for field primatology. So, I mean, we did have more information then about chimpanzees and gorillas and macaques than, especially from captivity, than we did from other animals. Those species, he's pretty much right. But in 1966, we already had preliminary information for titi monkeys in South America and for langur monkeys, the monkeys I would go on to study, that they shared care of their infants and that others could hold. In fact, in titi monkeys, father holds the baby most of the time, except when the mother is suckling. We know much more about allomaternal care in langurs now. But for example, as I explained in my thesis, but we already knew this in 1966. On the first day of life, a mother is allowing others to take her baby. And of course, they're all close relatives. Langur female.
In langurs, okay.
Mother spends her entire life in the same group with her mother and her grandmother and her aunts, her sisters. And, these are her kinfolk, and she can count on getting her baby back safely. Chimpanzees are unusual in that it is the female who leads the group when she goes to breed. So she doesn't have kin in the group. So that was part of the story. Another part of the story is of course, langurs, because they're leaf eaters, are not very competitive over food. And whereas macaques and baboons are very hierarchical. And so females don't want a subordinate to take her baby. It wouldn't be safe. And a subordinate is never going to get her hands on a dominant female's babies because they might not get it. And you do have kidnapping. And anyway, Bowlby picked the wrong templates. And since we did have that information for langurs and titi monkeys back that early, I have to suspect that part of where he went wrong was his own Victorian upbringing, and that he projected onto our ancestors his own societies, more patriarchal families.
And not only his own upbringing, I think probably the upbringing that he felt like he missed, because he was a boarding school kid, right? As so many was, and I think he was open about the fact that did impact him negatively, and probably he then thought, due to the Victorian certain kind of values, that what I missed was a mother there all the time, period.
I think you're right. I think two things make me think you're right. One is Bowlby's son, Sir Richard Bowlby, came to the farm.
Who I have met, by the way, when I was a child.
Well, he thinks that.
Okay.
This thing is
interesting.
The wonderful, wonderful biography of Darwin that Bowlby wrote, one of my favorite books. And in it, he describes Darwin's own childhood so poignantly. And he got into writing his biography of Darwin because Darwin himself lost his mother very young. She died. And he was very, very overbearing sisters. And Bowlby's own analysis, you've probably heard about Darwin's illness. Everybody has these hypotheses for why Darwin was sick. I think he had migraines like me. Bowlby thought he had panic anxieties due to the insecurities developed when his mother died.
Interesting. Okay.
So Bowlby was very, very interested in mother loss. He lost his favorite nanny. He was reared by a nanny, and when she left, it was traumatic.
Okay. And I guess one thing that I don't know if this is the right time to raise this point, but one tricky issue here is that there are two questions. One is, how much do we need one primary caregiver? And then we bond to the primary caregiver, which almost always is the mother, but not always, versus how much is it that it has to be a female primary caregiver, for example. So I guess that's a little bit of a complication, but certainly Bowlby tended to, I guess, say yes to both. Yes, there's a primary caregiver. One person is super important. And the other thing is that for him, it was just the most natural thing to say that would be the mother in almost all the cases. Is that right?
Yes. And going back to your initial question about the misperceptions, I believe this. I had read John Bowlby before it's right here. My little on attachment. Look how beaten up it is, And when I brought my baby home from the hospital, Katrinka home from the hospital, I was going to be the mother of a securely attached, confident little human. I felt I had to be with her every moment. And, the least squeak from her, and I was there. This was fine for a while. My husband had to go back to work, and I was alone in the house with this baby. And my second book had just been published, and I really wanted to go on writing. And I started to feel really ambivalent about the demands 24/7 of this little baby. And this is when I really started to think about this, which is, wait a minute, do I belong on Freud's couch? Is something wrong with me that I don't want to just turn my life over? But I didn't. I wanted someone there. I wanted to get help.
Yes, there's a great quote in your book, which, if I may quote you to yourself, you write that, I quote, "I saw myself as the mammary possessing descendant of a long line of African apes whose babies needed to be constantly held by their mother in order to be safe from roving predators. Striving up to the Bowlbyan ideals, I kept Katrinka in near constant contact, just as Bowlby's go-to template a chimpanzee mother would," unquote.
Thank you. I probably said exactly that, no doubt.
Yeah.
That's how I felt. And that really launched me on what, of course, culminated ultimately in Mother Nature, which is a book about maternal love and ambivalence,
Yeah.
which in humans is a very prominent thing. And we suppress it, though, it's starting to be much more widely recognized, certainly in the West. And you have books coming out like, I don't know how she does it. And, it is being right. But back then, it was still assumed that mothers would turn their lives over to these babies.
Yeah. And that it would be so natural that they don't mind.
They don't mind. In Bowlby's defense, there was a second body of evidence that would have corrected him, but we didn't have it in 1966.
And what is that?
The detailed ethnographic accounts of child rearing in hunter-gatherer societies. You really need to look at the mobile hunter-gatherers, immediate return foragers, and so forth, to find the high levels of shared care. And when you get into the ethnographic literature, it's so obvious that in mobile hunter-gatherer societies, mothers have always had a community of others helping them with their babies. And, if you read, the wonderful early accounts of the coon, like Melvin Connor's, where the baby is always at eye level with others, and even in the coon, which for hunter-gatherers have a lot of mother-infant contact, 25% of the time, babies are being held by others. In the arch allomotherers among like the FA hunter-gatherers, they're on allomothers, 30 to 60% of the time.
Yeah.
And much of that time is actually the allomothers are other women, often other lactating women who will briefly nurse the baby. But if you look at the one other person besides the mother who's doing the most, it is the father in the FA. And that's why Barry Hewlett, who was studying the FA early on, wrote his wonderful 1991 book, Intimate Fathers, the role of fathers there. And I was kind of, I listened to your interview with Nail Chadhari.
Yes, I was asking if you knew that I did an episode.
He doesn't mention Barry Hewlett, whose findings with the Aka, closely related to the Bayanka, are really the same as his.
Yeah. I mean, in all fairness, I'm almost certain that he does in the paper.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
But what he's doing is I think very important. And I think one of the reasons perhaps we have different kind of focus, because I think he's actually interested in public health.
Yep.
He wants to take this information and apply it in the current world, which of course is being done very effectively in Britain with these visiting nurses. I mean, it's just so surprising that these tiny interventions of a supportive woman visiting a new mother have profound effects.
And the tiny intervention is nurses who visit the parents every once in a while before and after the childbirth. They're not very many times. They're like, what was it overall? Like maybe even less than 10 visits overall.
And by different numbers, but yes, it's not like having an au pair.
Yeah, it's not very expensive as a public health intervention.
It isn't. And there's a guy named Oles in this country who's been doing similar studies. And they've been doing it for the last, I think, 18 years, must be longer by now. And they're finding that 18 years later, you pick up differences in, how long the mother breastfed, how well the child adapts in school, how likely it is to finish college. These are remarkable from a tiny intervention. So I think the work that he's doing is very important.
And I think it's just a nice reminder, because there is a problem sometimes, I feel like, in this kind of discussion is that, well, okay, it's nice to hear that everything was very nice in the place to see him and we lived as hunter-gatherers, all of us, but now most of us don't. So, what shall we do? That is one thing that we can do.
There's certain respects, not many. I mean, of course, it's very, very different, and you're right. But as we're beginning to see, knock on wood that it continues, because there's a lot of pushback. But as we continue to see the lapsing of patriarchal paradigms, think about it. We have women doing paid labor outside the home. This is labor that is valued just as much as the tubers and the nuts those hunter-gatherer women we're bringing back.
Mhm.
They're really valued, and they have residential autonomy. So it
Yeah.
means a grandmother can pick up and go near the daughter who needs her. A daughter can leave the husband who's not helping her much, and she is likely to have matrilineal kin or others supporting her. The government
Mm.
will protect women's rights. And of course, a kind of in general, a loosening of gender straitjackets. We are seeing fathers and partners getting more involved.
Yeah.
And I think I have to be careful because I don't really, you help me out how to talk about this, but I mean, I don't want to say we're returning to a hunter-gatherer system because we're
I
not.
guess we're finding better ways of solving this eternal problems, which
There's certain
they had
features
an
that are,
easier solution for. I was just gonna say in that interview, I embarrassingly first really badly misrepresent one of your core ideas, and then luckily do correct myself after I said at one point that infanticide doesn't really happen in other primates, whereas of course it happens all the time. But what I meant, and then I tried to correct myself soon after in the discussion, was that what doesn't happen much in chimpanzees, baboons, etc., that Bobby was looking at, what doesn't happen is that mother herself abandons or kills her own
yeah.
offspring, and that what in humans seems that, am I right that you see the fact that in humans this does happen a lot as part of the fact that we expect support, we expect there to be others, and if there is only a mother, it can be really overwhelming.
You're absolutely right. And you're right. You did catch yourself. And I admire that, Ilara, because we all get things slightly off and then you go back and I do that all the time.
I was actually, it's funny because I remember thinking that I really hope that she keeps listening the next 5 minutes when I do correct myself.
Your pressing was the difference between humans and most other primates, where infanticide by males of offspring born to a female he doesn't know is so reflexive and automatic. And in humans, males are encountering babies they didn't sire all the time, apes on a plane, and humans don't try to kill them.
Yeah, I personally can guarantee I have never tried to kill a strange infant who I meet.
I know. It's pretty uncommon. And when those cases do happen, like the one my good friend Martin Daly and wonderful and his wife Wilson reported on years ago, the stepfathers, that there's a 70% much higher incidence
Yeah,
of
basically stepdads are bad news for the percentage wise risk
yes.
of
And this
infanticide.
is true. But if you put it in context, think of all the step parents, the stepfathers who aren't killing their babies.
Yeah. The percentages go up, but they go from tiny to a little bit less tiny, but still.
Except, of course, in genocidal warfare. And that is, of course, a way to terrorize your opponents because guess what? All primates are really horrified and react very powerfully when they see a baby being attacked. And, when we wanted to get to mobilize America against Saddam Hussein, remember, he made up this propaganda about newborns being tossed out of incubators. It wasn't true, but it helped to animalize.
Yeah, baby killer is a word that is recently being used again by both sides in the conflict.
Yeah, and of course, the work on infanticide that I did was so controversial for so long. And Amanda Rees, a British historian of science, did a wonderful monograph about it called The Infanticide Controversy. Very authoritative. She does not take a side in the scientific controversy. She just is trying to talk about sociologically why it was so inflammatory
Interesting.
and went on in anthropology long after biologists had all just accepted it and didn't even realize.
What exactly had biologists accepted?
Sexual selection hypothesis, the idea that males are competing with other males for access to females, with the results that the loser doesn't die, but has less reproductive success. when I was having trouble explaining this bizarre phenomena that I had gone to India to study, why these males were killing infants. And remember, my starting hypothesis, which was wrong, my starting hypothesis was that this was produced by crowding because these monkeys were at very high population density. And so males pathologically lashing out at the most vulnerable. But that's not what I saw. Males are very tolerant of babies, and they lie around all day next to the females in the group, and the babies jump on males like trampolines. They're aloof, ignore the babies, but they're not attacking them. Males were only attacking infants when they came into the breeding system from outside it. And I abandoned my social pathology hypothesis that this was crowding, and I started to explain it in terms of the Darwinian theory of sexual selection, males competing with other males by eliminating the last choice that female had made and then inserting their own baby.
Yeah. Can I, by the way, ask quickly, you mentioned just on the, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because I know it's not exactly your expertise, but just very quickly on the point of how common human infanticide is. When looking at hunter-gatherers, for example, or other non-industrial societies, I see different numbers, but sometimes they're relatively high. What's your impression? How much is that? How much is it part of this allo parenting story of if it does take a village, well, then the village has more say in whether they are able to take a new child on board, where versus is it like males competing for, like I want to be with her if I'm going to kill her or die.
This question has to be answered at several levels.
Okay.
First, the data question. It is very, very difficult to get information on mothers who kill their own babies. They don't want to talk about it. And I kind of wish we had a different term for infanticide by men and infanticide by mothers. Infanticide is a fairly violent act. Infanticide by mothers is really done by regret. It's not a violent act typically. And when anthropologists come and try to interview, women don't want to talk about it. And the best data really come from talking to people who knew that it happened and recording data that way. Probably the very best data we have on human infanticide is Nancy Howell's demographer who worked with the Coombe back in the 1970s with the Harvard Kalahari Project. She has probably the best data on Coombe infanticide, these hunter-gatherers now called the Junwasi. And it looks like it's 1 in 100. Often, baby born too close to an older sibling. I think once allomaternal assistance becomes obligate, the baby is not going to survive and the mother is not going to do well without it. Mothers calculate in social support subconsciously into their bonding with their baby.
No, but this is a really important link to what we have been talking about since the very beginning, which is Bowlby. Because I guess well, you did a very careful job in not saying that Bowlby is wrong. You said that he's done more good for human well-being than any other evolutionary theorist. And indeed, it's not that in a typical scenario, the mother doesn't matter. But it's like you said, that there is this natural subconscious and conscious expectation of social support. And when that is lacking, that's when there's trouble ahead.
The data on marmosets are pretty clear. Marmosets, which
are also cooperative breeders, like who have a lot of these allomothers.
The fathers are doing most of the care, other males in the group. And of course, several of them have made it mothers. So they could be the fathers. So you don't,
they're not pair bonded. They're quite liberal.
Well, yes. Though there is a pair bond. There is a primary.
Oh, there is a pair bonding. Oh, I see. I thought that they don't have pair bonds.
Not exclusive. I don't know what's going on.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Special relationship for sure.
Okay.
Judith Berkeley.
Because some of the New World monkeys are pair bonded and really monogamous, right? Like the titi monkeys and the owl monkeys.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That comes a lot from the captive data, where people noticed that the best way to rear marmosets and have high infant survival was to put just one male and one female in a cage together. And you say they're monogamous, as meant to be.
Yeah. But you were saying about tamarins and marmosets who you think are better models in some sense for humans than chimpanzees and baboons. because they have this shared care.
They're better models up to a point because, of course, we haven't had a shared ancestor with marmosets and tamarins for 35 million years.
Yeah. Whereas chimpanzees is 6 or 7.
In the meantime, old world monkeys and apes have gone on and they have developed, well, for one thing, much bigger brains, a much more sophisticated kind of social cognition. And marmosets are wonderful at sharing, but they're not very interested in what somebody else is thinking.
Okay.
You can stare into their eyes and they don't get upset. You stare into the eyes of a macaque and you're going to get your face bitten. So that some of Judith Burkhart's and mine, our early proposals about marmosets and human cognition were criticized by people who said, well, look at marmosets. They have brains the size of a hazelnut. That's true. But hominins, when they evolved cooperative breeding, were starting from a very different place.
By the way, very quickly, I think it's just very interesting to quickly point out the work that you did do with Judith Burkhardt, where you basically found that, was it that the thing that seems to link humans and these other cooperative breeders, tamarins, marmosets, different level of brain growth, but a very similar way of impulsive sharing, or a very similar way of sharing food, for example, very, very instinctive, which doesn't happen in any of the African apes.
Absolutely. Judith is a cognitive psychologist, and that was her entree into this. She was really interested in these adults being so eager to share. And we made, I think, a good team. I love working with her. She's a wonderful scholar. But I was more interested in the infants. But Burkhardt, with her mentor, my longtime revered colleague, Carl von Schaik, she and Carl went on to do wonderful work on how primates with cooperative breeding are more pro-social than animals. And a wonderful behavioral economist, a brilliant behavioral economist at the University of San Francisco, Alexandra Kassar, and her colleagues are starting to show in some traditional societies a general trend. It's kind of tentative. This is they haven't published it yet. They're still working it out. But that you have more inter-individual trust in societies with more allomaternal care. Well, that is really interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so tamarins and marmosets are not like humans. They're very different in many ways, but the correction that the Bowlbian theory needed, you think, is to not just look at chimpanzees, but take at least some inspiration from these other cooperative breeders, where babies are passed around and treated by those. And this is also a kind of, I guess, a step towards the theme of your most recent book, Father Time, about the role of fathers. I mean, actually, you know what? I really appreciated that you started your book with personal stories, and not just personal, but kind of 3 generations and how things have changed. Any conversation about, human nature, human biology, comparing this is what chimpanzees do, this is what humans do, is going to be difficult, because of course humans can do things very differently. And I think you really did a wonderful job at just showing how aware you are and how aware we should all be about how much cultures differ, even, and not just across the globe, but also just within Texas. 3 generations can be so different. And you said that the way you were raised was pre-Bowlbian. Your mother had studied a little bit of psychology and was quite convinced that warmth is not something important. Bonding is not, attachment is not a useful thing to think about. I hope that it wasn't only bad, but you definitely didn't. I guess Watson's contribution to your mother's behavior is not one that you applauded.
Yeah, I'm waiting for the pushback from my natal family, who,
Yeah.
read my work. So I think.
But then you have your generation, and you tried to be the perfect Bowlbian mother, with your husband going to work, you staying home. And you say that this is there were insights, but there was something that was lacking. And one of the things that was lacking was the feeling that you were alone, very much alone. And now looking at this kind of from a evolutionary biological point, there's been two typical answers to where should the support have come from in human past. And these don't need to become alternatives, but let me just put it this way as a kind of easy thing to follow. One answer has been that it comes from the father, and that we evolved pair bonding, something resembling monogamy, which you don't see in great apes, for example. Okay, so these pair bonds explain how mothers received help in the human story. And then the other answer is the answer that your name is very much associated with, which is that, well, it wasn't really the dads that much. It was more grandmothers, aunts, non-related group members. And yeah, maybe the fathers, but the father is typically just one of those allomothers.
Oh, Larry, you blushed a little bit when you said that.
No, did I?
Yeah.
Well, how do you interpret that?
I guess you're embarrassed for your sex. I mean, because the thing is that even men who know they are fathers sometimes behave as didn't know they had children. It's not built into us, but the transformative power of babies is built into primates generally, and we have that.
So how fair is this kind of categorization of two typical alternatives, that looking in the evolutionary literature about where do human mothers typically get help, that one place to look at has been that the support comes from monogamous relationships with pair-bonded partners, i.e. the dad. And the other answer has been the one that you're associated with more, which is that it's allomothers more generally, and often not even the dad as much as maybe the grandmother or...
Mothers get help wherever they can get it.
Okay, yes.
The thing about grandmothers is they're ideal in the sense that they're experienced and they're highly motivated and experienced, but they're not necessarily present. They get old and they die. They may live somewhere else. They may have more than one child. But fortunately, if you read Kristen Hawkes' work carefully, sometimes it's a great aunt. It's not necessarily.
Yes, it doesn't have to be the grandmother.
I think her work is wonderful. I have a better idea of who can help. And sometimes the father. It's just, we women can't always count on the fathers. I've often described monogamy as a compromise that children win. And they do win. And it's very important. And people who are committed to their children realize the importance of maintaining these bonds. On the other hand, there's so much information about stepfathers. If they've spent enough time with a baby, they actually are quite investing. Earlier, the better. It's just like with adoptions. The earlier. Of course, often stepfathers are coming in after the kid is already older and when they're an adolescent, which is just a trial for anybody.
Yes, exactly. Well, you know what? I maybe it's a good time to ask then. So living through the three generations, from your parents taking the behaviorist stance, no consoling when crying because it teaches you to cry.
My father took no stance on children. He just didn't want to be bothered.
Oh, and that's a very important part of it. Yes. So the father not taking a part, the mother being a Watsonian behaviorist. And then in your generation, you taking the Bowlbian stance. And if I understand correctly, your husband definitely being there for the birth, being in many ways supportive, but there was no paternal leave, etc. How did you see that? You really described quite strikingly that this change from your generation to the next. So you want to talk a little bit about that and how that inspired the book Father Time?
Well, I had never seen a man change a diaper, and it's happening everywhere. It's just amazing. Reading the French philosopher Ivan Jablonka's book on the history of masculinity. Have you read it?
No.
It's just remarkable how interested he is in men being more involved in infant care. Such a book could not have been written in the 20th century. That is a 21st century book. And so much of Father Time is kind of a mystery story because I'm trying to understand how this can be happening in an ape with our phylogenetic history of no male care. And obviously, there are a lot of intervening social and cultural changes, women's movements in many parts of the world, new technologies, baby bottles and safe formula, breast pump, so that a father can do this all-important task of providing safe nutrition for the baby. I still agree with pediatricians that breastfed babies, it's emotionally and nutritionally a good idea, but it's not essential for baby
Yeah.
survival or
Yeah.
prosperity. And by the way, we have to be careful talking about that subject, because in less developed countries where you don't have safe water and safe formula, not breastfeeding is a death sentence for a baby.
Yeah.
We have to be
Yes.
about what we're talking about. Developed societies with very high infant survival. Remember, back in the Pleistocene, 30% of infants are going to die. In bad times, probably 100%, And today, 98, 99% of babies born in a developed Western society with grocery stores and modern medical help are going to survive. This has changed the outlook of parents so much. And of course, we're much more focused on other things. You get your helicopter parents because we're worried about our children's futures and class slippage and are they going to get into the right schools and all this stuff. But we're not in constant contact with them in the sense that we're worried they're going to die if we don't.
Yeah.
We're not. Humans evolved to respond to threats to their infant survival. We didn't evolve to respond to psychological distress, because an infant that wasn't in constant contact with somebody, a mother or an allomother, was not going to survive. When I'm in a faculty meeting or a party for faculty and I see someone's child just so neglected or glued to their iPhone or something, and I'm thinking to myself, God, I wish that child would go up to the corner of the room and just beat its head against the wall to signal, I'm not getting what I need. And we're in such bad directions on that. And it's going to sound so perverse to say this, but I really think infants today survive too well. If there were more threats to their actual physical well-being, parents would be more responsive to the emotional needs of their children.
When you decided to start writing Father Time, you said that part of it is a mystery story of how on earth, how can we unleash this much hidden potential from dads that people who would look in the 60s around themselves in for example, America, or who would look at chimpanzees or other evolutionary cousins would say that, well, the dads are just not naturally made for caring. What did you find?
Well, I hesitate to talk about it for two reasons. Like with any good mystery, you don't give away the end. Number one. Number two is the end is so unbelievable that I myself have trouble believing it. And my colleagues had, when I mentioned to this expert on Amazonian child rearing and parental care that I was writing a book on nurturing potential of men, laughed. And he said, Sarah, this one's going to be a short book. It's like I was going off to study the feeding habits of the yeti here. But we have changed the circumstances of human existence in unprecedented ways for an ape and really for most mammals, because we have these social transformations where we expect men to do more. And, women working outside the home and more education for women, new laws, new ways of producing babies. 2 gay men can hire a surrogate and have a baby, are really changing all the circumstances around it in unprecedented ways. So that has to be understood. This is unprecedented stuff.
Yeah, you say in the book that even amongst the hunter-gatherers where you have the most notoriously caring dads, you don't really see the level of paternal care that you can see in modern 21st century society.
For example, if you talk to him, he'll tell you that even with a whole lot of allomaternal care, the mother is still the primary figure.
Yeah.
And fathers are very responsive to their babies, and they really are clued into what they're doing, but they're not turning their lives over to their firsthand care. They do, wipe excrement and so forth, they clean them and so forth, but they're not really primary caretakers in any sense of the word. But we are seeing primary caretakers who are men.
Yeah. Men
are put in prolonged intimate proximity with babies right from birth. And this does something to them. It really does. I call it the tipping point. It kind of transforms them. It puts them within reach of the transformative power of babies, and it activates neural circuits in their brain, which go way back in time. And in order to understand this, I really needed to learn more neuroscience. And oh God, that was so challenging for me. It would take me a whole day to read one of these papers and all the act. These people right now.
Oh yeah. A lot of
It's just
acronyms, yeah.
not a concern at all for their readers from other fields. Anyway, I struggled through it. And of course, came across the work of Roselma.
Oh, her work is just amazing. I had her on the show as one of the very first guests.
You didn't hear her. Oh, I'll have to go back and
yeah, it's really, really exceptional. You want to give a quick summary of what you really took away from her work?
found was, of course, as a child developmental psychologist, but she also had this background in music, in jazz music. And she was very interested in synchrony and became really fascinated by the kind of synchrony that develops between parents and their offspring, including the mothers and their offspring, but also fathers. And when the floodgates opened and we started to learn, finally, belatedly, that males in the human species also are psychoendocrinologically, their hormone levels change. Testosterone goes down, prolactin goes up in new fathers. When she heard about this work, she said, we need to look at what's going on in their brain. She wanted to get inside their heads. So she started to do these brain scans in conjunction with some very talented postdocs. And what they found is in the brains of fathers helping a mother out, it was the newer frontal cortical, neocortical parts of their brain that were most implicated.
Unlike in the mothers. So for listeners, this is not the end of the story, but this is an important step. So the first finding is in the typical heterosexual couple where the mother is the primary caregiver, the mother's and father's brains look different. And we could have concluded that, there's a sex difference, biological sex difference, father brains like this, mother brains like that. But the story continues, right?
Yeah, in way I do, yes. And then they took advantage of this absolutely unique 21st century opportunity of gay couples in Israel contracting with a surrogate. One of them could have been the father, but in most of their sample, how many of these couples did they have? Was it 40?
I don't remember. I don't know if I even checked it out, which I should.
Yeah.
But yeah.
This absolutely unique opportunity, not unprecedented, not unique anymore, unprecedented opportunity for for two men to adopt a baby and rear that baby right from birth with no mother involved. Yeah. Whoa. This has never happened in 200 million years. Yeah. This has never happened before. And what they found is, lo and behold, the same ancient portions of their brain that are activated in a mother are activated in them.
I think what's fascinating was that it's so tempting to see a difference between the average mother and the average father, and then conclude that this is a part of being a mother period or being a father period. But actually what probably is going on is not so much a sex difference as a time in proximity with the infant difference, that in the typical straight couple where the mom is the primary caregiver and spending many, many, many more hours, their brains react differently to the baby. But there's nothing inherent about the male brain that would be any less capable of that. Because I can see someone coming in and saying, oh yeah, but that's gay dads, they have there's something different about their brain. But there's pretty good evidence that that's not the case. It really has to do with the time in proximity with the infant, right?
I saw it happening in my son-in-law.
Yeah.
That's what he started. He's not gay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Y'all, I'm starting to lose my voice.
That's okay. Don't worry. We're in a good moment to start wrapping things up.
No, anyone mystery solved, y'all will have to read the book.
So would there be two call to action? One is to solve the mystery, read Father Time when it comes out this May. And the other one is that if you are a dad and you want to mold your brain to be as caring as possible, do spend time with the infant.
And there's advice to the mother too, because mothers are often the gatekeeper and they're very worried that the father, if they take care of a new baby, he won't do a good job. And he may be awkward at first, but he will do a good job.
That's amazing. Is there anything that you would have really wanted me to ask and I haven't asked?
You're going to ask it. And I've prepared an answer.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Well, how has all the work that you've done shaped your outlook on humanity?
Instead of starting with what Darwin thought of as man's unfortunate birthright to be competitive and selfish, the things you talked about in distorting Darwinism, I'm starting out and increasingly impressed by not so much our unfortunate birthright or original sin, but what is, if not exactly original goodness, is at least original niceness. I think that little humans, enter the world equipped to grow up, eager to get along with and share and cooperate with others, provided they evolve in social contexts where such gifts are rewarded and permitted to fully develop. You want to ask me how to ensure that?
How do we ensure that?
The obvious. Safe and accessible birth control, so every child is born a wanted child. Generous parental leave with social norms encouraging men as well as women to take it. Plenty of allomaternal support, including safe and affordable high-quality daycare. And oh yes, we need to avoid war, the enemy of caring environments for rearing children, and of course, avoid nuclear holocaust and planetary destruction. Simple, right? As I argue in Father Time, it's not human nature that has so much to answer for. It's sexual selection, untrammeled, unconstrained sexual selection. Age-old primate impulses to strive for dominance and social clout. Statuses bringing privileged access to resources and mates. That's not going away. It's in us. We're primates. But as much of the early ethnographic work with hunter-gatherers shows, the work that has impressed me so much by Lorna Marshall and Richard Lee and others, positive social selection, which is how our behavior is affected by others and how we affect others. And what we are learning is that social selection has this power to constrain and reshape selfish tendencies, especially in a species like ours, where all but the real sociopaths care what others think about them. They care about their reputations for decency and integrity. Right from infancy, children were encouraged among hunter-gatherers to share, and in adulthood, the most highly regarded individuals were those with reputations for generosity and helpfulness. Link such reputations with cultural and reproductive success, and provided those conditions can persist long enough, a big if with all the pushback these days, provided they can persist long enough, our species might just outlive its pending destruction predicted on the doomsday clock. That's what I've learned.
Professor Sarah Hrdy, thank you so much for all the work and your time today.
Thank you, Ilaria. It's fun talking to you.
So that was it for today. If you enjoyed this and want to listen to more, episode 34 would be a great place to start. It's the one that we refer to in this conversation with Nikki Chowdhury. But you could also really enjoy episode 21 with Richard Wrangham, another giant in the field of comparing humans to other primates, in his case chimpanzees and bonobos. And as always, if you feel like I deserve it, please do give a 5-star review to the show on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Please do consider sharing this episode if there's someone who you think might enjoy it. And finally, if you want to become a paying patron, you can do so at patreon.com/onhumans. Thank you as always for listening. Until next time, take care.